Welcome to the Lighthouse Conversations, a show featuring entrepreneurs and tastemakers from the worlds of arts, culture, tech, and of course food. I'm your host, Hashem. We're kicking off the new year as always with our producer Chirag looking back at 2022 and sharing some of our sneak peeks into 2023. And as is our tradition, we recorded this episode on my birthday.
Well, happy birthday again.
Thank you. What do you mean again?
Well, because last year we recorded on your birthday.
Okay. Oh, did we really?
Yeah, so I was actually thinking
Don't seem very excited about my birthday. I mean, that's sort of I have a hunch that you seem kind of like,
Oh, I was actually going to take it bigger than that. So I was going to say that it may have been a coincidence that we landed up doing, twice in a year on your birthday. But I think we should make it a tradition. We should record this review every year.
But does that tell you how much I must love you to come on my birthday in the morning, chipper, happy as I usually am, and record this conversation? That really tells you something about my love for this podcast and for everybody that's involved in it.
What's funny is you made the same point last year.
Did I really? Oh my God.
Yeah, so it definitely means something. Yeah,
that just means I'm 49. I forget. That's all it does. But
so next year is going to be 50.
Thank you. And next year I'm not showing up. I'm not coming. No, I'm not coming. I'm going to do like a no-show. In fact, like being one of these blowout, you know what I mean? Like, where is he? Like, is he okay? Like, yeah, I feel with 50, like it needs to be like
So it'll be a conversation with me and Farah, like debating where you are, essentially.
Exactly. You'll be like both, like, where's Waldo? You know what I mean? Like one of those you know what I mean? Like he was spotted yesterday, with his daughter at 7 p.m. at a Thai restaurant. Then we don't know. Something like that. So, yeah.
And that would be like the basis of every true crime podcast. So we would actually
100%.
shift our
100%. Okay. But let's stick with 49. And I think I'm here today and I'm happy to talk about last year.
So let's do the sort of the higher level stuff, which is, what did you feel about 2022 in terms of the show? Yeah,
look, I feel great, to be honest. It's interesting. I think we discussed every year, I think around this time, we kind of look back and we talk about certain things we want to do next year. And I feel like it's not always the case, right? Which is kind of beautiful, to be honest, because what I'm learning with the show, as probably with many other podcasts, is that going a little bit with the flow, with some direction. Obviously, we have a purpose, we have a mission, is good, and not feeling the need to stick to stick to a particular script is also useful. So, for example, one small example is we had discussed potentially going out of the region, and kind of going to people on a global level, talking to them about their stories. And it just didn't feel like right for this particular show. I'm happy for people to be situated physically anywhere in the world. But to me, it felt very much a show for and about the Middle East in some way. And it didn't feel right, as I was starting to think about guests, to completely leave that behind. So it's interesting. It's something we discussed. I mean, we obviously didn't implement it, but when I was thinking in my head about guests, I felt like, no, there's so many interesting stories here that we haven't covered. So many interesting people that I'm still meeting, certainly, and I'm sure you are as well, on a day-to-day basis.
Absolutely.
And the region is changing so fast. So there's a lot for us to do. I would have to say, I would like to see us going and covering more stories in places like Egypt and Saudi and so on and so forth, where there's a lot going on. I thought for a minute, maybe it's interesting to have done something around in Qatar when the World Cup was happening. But then I felt, we're not that kind of show again. It has a timelessness that I think is very dear to all our hearts, where we're not necessarily events driven. I know we're going to speak a little bit about how events have shaped the show a little bit, but generally speaking, we're not a show that's about the
current affairs or
the big last big thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think also it's we talk often on these reviews about the evolution of the show, right, and how we're seeing that grow. So a little bit of that is the learning. So what you were talking about, where we've explored a lot of different ideas, and then some of them don't feel true to the show. And I think some of that we learn as we start exploring them, as opposed to sort of conceptualizing it in advance.
And I feel the learnings we've had, again, go more of the sort of timeless nature. Certain things that we learn about entrepreneurs and about being an entrepreneur and about the challenges of building brands and so on, those don't feel timestamped to me.
Yeah.
Now there may be another show in our future, who knows, that would talk about current events, which I find fascinating. I'm someone that, as you are, I know, that covers current events in his day-to-day life. I mean, I listen to it. I consume a lot of media online. So I like to follow and I have opinions on it, but it's not this show. It may be something else.
We did experiment and kind of do different things this year. So we managed finally to go to Abu Dhabi and record with Nadia there,
Yes, that was fantastic.
which was great. And it's something, by
At
the
our
way,
library in Abu Dhabi. That was very special.
I mean, the setting and the space is just fantastic.
The
first
setting
of
was
all.
unique, no doubt.
And
I'd love
it's-
to do more there.
Yeah, and I think that there's, when we started the show, we talked about the live events. We did one with His Excellency Zaki Nasiba back then.
Yes.
And then, of course, situations prevented us from continuing to do that.
Yes.
And I think this was a kind of a nice way to kind of go back to that.
Yes.
So we were able to go, it wasn't a live show, but it was a location-specific show. So we were able to do that in Abu Dhabi.
And it was interesting because it was in a library. Nadia had written her book. She was a bookseller. It's in the title of the book. It's about a bookstore. So it felt very special to have that. I don't think that was deliberate, as it happens that she was going to be in Abu Dhabi. And we decided to showcase and decided to host her there. But that made it extra special.
Yeah, which also, by the way, comes because the Lighthouse has grown and now you have all these other additional locations, which makes it an interesting space to go set up and do interesting things.
Yes,
right? So,
absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it's nice to go and venture in those locations. The Lighthouse in Abu Dhabi in Yes Bay, I think particularly lends itself to that. And this room even more so than anywhere else. I would love to have all our podcasts recorded there. Not that I have anything against our studio here, but yes, you're right. And I think it's part of the growth of the show to also showcase and document in some ways the growth of the Lighthouse.
Yeah, and that's, I think, what I'm coming to is how both of them now have their own identities. So at one point it was, there's the Lighthouse, and then this is an additional thing we did. And today the Lighthouse Conversations, 3 years strong, has its own identity.
Yeah, 64, 65 episodes.
Exactly. And so it has its own identity. We kind of have a very good feel of it. We discuss it a lot, you and me do. But then I get feedback from people who listen to the show and have their thoughts about it. I thought it was to me, as a producer, the episode with Ahmed Al-Mari from Canvas was its own significant milestone because he talked about what he believed the purpose of the show was. Or he was kind of saying what he was taking away from the show and how much in sync it was with what we are trying to do with the show.
When you first approached me to the podcast, that was a year ago, and I had no idea how the Lighthouse Conversations would grow. Now, after hearing most of the episodes, after listening to most of the episodes,
thank you.
It feels now that I am stepping into a mental health facility. And because
it's a lot,
and there's a reason, because I'm not the only one who's suffering from imposter syndrome and suffering from issues. Everybody else is. What this platform has highlighted is, yes, there are successful people, but everybody has issues.
I think that was one of the main reasons we launched this podcast 3+ years ago, which was essentially you said it, everybody has issues, but the idea was we wanted to unmask the person a little bit, not to say that they just have issues, to say that they have a journey. Let's talk about that journey.
It's a journey of growth.
And the journey of growth will invariably have pros and cons, highs and lows. And let's not gloss over that, because without that, you don't get to where this person is. And it was funny because we didn't discuss this with him and he kind of hit it on the mark. So I'm very proud of that because I feel like we didn't force this podcast or this show to try to grow in a certain way. We let it happen organically until we all sort of came together and said, you know what, we should now give it its own identity. So now we will have it'll have its own Instagram page, its own identity and social media in general. And I feel it's not forced. I feel it got to a point where there's so much to cover, a lot of content that we want to showcase, and it certainly doesn't fit anymore just as part of the Lighthouse, social media presence. Number one. Number two, to your point, I mean, it does feel a bit like a therapy session, and I think because the Lighthouse in itself is an entrepreneurial venture that's growing, I feel I relate fully to a lot of those entrepreneurs that come here, especially people like Ahmed, as you said, that are building something on their own from scratch with all the errors and the mistakes and the successes and the ups and the downs.
And the uniqueness of the region included on top of that. We all know. And
yes, we all are. I mean, your business is similar, right? And I think that's why you relate in a very special way, and maybe the questioning or the conversation takes a certain direction. I feel if we were Kristan Amanpour or, to bring a blast from the past, or, Larry King, you have your established show, or even a Charlie Rose. When you bring entrepreneurs, you're the established, or, Barbara Walters, or, whoever.
I'm surprised you haven't mentioned Kara Swisher yet. This is incredible.
I was going to get there. I was going with the TV personalities first. Kara has a special, I think Kara is a bit different because she morphed as well,
course,
right?
Yeah.
I mean, she morphed in her show. She's a journalist at heart. That's a little bit different. But I feel like when you go on those shows as an entrepreneur, you're the entrepreneur and you're going to the established
You're
show.
the upstart. You're the, yeah.
Correct. In our case, I feel like it's both. We are growing. We are morphing as they are in most cases. So that makes a very, very interesting conversation.
Well, speaking of established, we finally got Fadi Gandour on the show.
Yes.
After 3-something years of waiting.
Hallelujah. Yeah. Yes.
He was actually supposed to be our very first guest.
Yeah.
Right?
I had bumped into him in the Lighthouse in the very early days. And I said, Fadi, I would love to have you on my podcast. And he said, let's do it. And then he
was the first name on our list. When we
started let's do it. I was like, oh, that's great. I was so excited. But it took 3 years. And that's fine too. I mean, again, everything happens in good time.
And even, by the way, when with Ahmed, it was the same thing, right? Like you had approached him, I think, a year before to come on the show, and he didn't feel he was ready. And then it kind of worked out in its own time, I think.
So that's different. But you're 100% right. So with Ahmed, it was more, and I do this often. Fadi is a very established figure,
Absolutely.
highly successful entrepreneur and businessman. Ahmed, obviously, is someone that's just building his business now. And I get a lot of the situations where I speak to them, I signal our interest. But if I don't feel they're ready to be on this kind of podcast, that's perfectly fine. And Ahmed has been one of a few, actually, that then come back and say, I'm ready now. And I think that's great.
I think that's fantastic.
As it should be, because, there was a couple of things. I mean, at that point, if you remember, it was kind of a big reveal. I mean, he had not identified, nobody knew who he was. They thought he was a woman. He was sort of hiding behind his social media. Not hiding, but...
Well, no, he called it hiding. He actually said he was hiding.
So he had to kind of first, I was like, you need to be comfortable. Once you do that, there's no going back. And it was fine. It was fine.
We can't talk about this review, especially of 2022, without talking about Bogja. So we have to.
Oh, good Lord.
I don't think I've heard you ever say the sentence, I feel outgunned, which I think was phenomenal in its own way.
Khalas, we became a brand. They wanted your name.
No, there was a big moment. We were in the FT.
No, you have to hold your horses.
Yeah. We took the FT and we asked for a meeting. Actually, we asked for a meeting.
This is the first time. I want to say, how many episodes have you? 65? This is the first time I am actually officially overwhelmed, which doesn't happen with me. But I love it. I'm outgunned, overwhelmed. I'm going to call your daughter's therapist. I need to see him.
I heard the episode again a couple of weeks ago, and it's fascinating. The whole dynamic was fascinating, it's something right?
Else. Sorry to interrupt you. I listened to it too in my car, and I burst out laughing, listening to it. I mean, it felt like, half reality show, half comedy show, but also so much life and substance and storytelling. So it wasn't sort of like just banter.
No, and I loved it, I think, because... as much as they've been in the press, and they've been in the press a lot, they've been doing this for 25 years. So it's not, they're established in ways that, and have experience in ways that maybe many entrepreneurs here are still kind of working their way up to. And yet it was authentic and open and
very
raw.
Much so. You really felt that you understood the dynamic of how they built a successful brand. It also, in my view, it popped the bubble a little bit, or demystified the concept that entrepreneurship or building brands is kind of, linear or all about agreement. They were clearly sitting there, and I'm sure they did the same thing with their collections and their work, obviously, right? They're, as you said, disagreeing, interrupting each other, cutting each other off, but also a lot of love, a lot of passion, a lot of care for each other, which was extremely evident to me, which I think made it very comfortable. Obviously, we're getting a lot of press.
Are you like an old couple who always,
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, but it's fun. It's fun. Yeah, it's fun. But it's like an old couple, but it's not old as in age, old as in you've been together for a long time. But it's dysfunctional just enough for it to be fun. And it's not dysfunctional where it's like, you know,
Get out of here.
Yeah, get out of here. Exactly.
Hello,
The energy is good.
you need counseling.
Alpha, it's just a little bit of the dysfunction that you need in a couple, which I love. But the relationship is fine. You guys are fine. If you want me, this is completely outside of the podcast, to come in as a couple therapist.
No, we've had someone
on a no-fee basis.
Let's not go there. Let me tell them about.
Let's not go there for now.
Yeah.
You know, it was really quite something and made me think of the brand differently. Because now every time I see a piece of furniture or a design that they've made, I kind of visualize them behind it and how that came together, and I smile.
And I think it was interesting, the contrast, right, where they started out very conscious of the fact that they were taking over the conversation. So there was a point where he said, "I'm sorry, we're not letting you talk," and stuff. And then the end, it was like, "Can you please wait? I'm not done with my story." And then, you know, it was just this like laugh, right? But there was so much stuff that came out of it, so much learning. And you see how, like you said, like the organic nature of how something comes together, how the sum of, I mean, how the larger whole is larger than the sum of the two parts individually, and that creation and how that goes together. And then, of course, these, what you would call these inflection points, and multiple of them that they had.
And the messiness of doing this, right? So, I mean, this was a beauty. And I think the messiness of doing it in Beirut, I think that was also very important. You know, speaking about taking over this abandoned building, right? And speaking about
rabbits,
with the rats and the rabbits and the guy that comes and cleans and becomes kind of the family. I mean, it was like, I was like, oh my God, that's a short story. You know, one of my plans for this year is to get back and being a bit active in writing. And I was like, these are like the great tidbits, short stories. You know, it's like a New Yorker short story. And that messiness, I think, is also something that I love about this show. It made me personally feel we are part of things as they evolve and as they develop. So you're really part, without being cliche about it, you're part of the zeitgeist as it evolves. And that's, I think, without doing current events or current news, that's not easy. I feel like you have people that are sitting there covering what happened last week. This is what happened, talking about it, and that's perfectly fine. Then you have sort of the more Charlie Rose type, you know, people that are talking about, you know, particular subjects. And I think we're kind of do a little bit of both, but we don't shy away now from also covering something that is in the zeitgeist, as long as it fits within the value system and the kind of broader umbrella of the show.
I think one of the things that we often talk about when it comes to the show is about talking about the journey, which is what we've always wanted to focus on, not just the destination. And then I think this is something that actually came out when we were talking to Brendan, who's creative director at the Museum of the Future.
One thing that's been useful for me is, so Richard Dawkins had this concept of the original concept of the meme is not what the internet version of it is. He created this notion of the meme, which is basically an idea-based version of a gene. It really speaks to this idea that what we're doing in all of our actions, including this podcast, is contributing to a continuum of culture.
A couple of years ago, I feel like if we were thinking about episodes like Michelin or Mina 50 Best,
we would have said no.
We would have said no, or we would have said, okay, maybe, but we want to talk about something else. If Michelin becomes a part of it, that's fine.
Yes.
And this year, we changed that from being the subtle, incidental part of the conversation where we land up documenting stuff that's happening in the region because someone's building something in it, to saying, why don't we document how this happens?
I think part of it is growing up. A lot of the actors that were part of the Mina 50 Best, that were part of Michelin, that were part of all of this, were already on the show. I mean, Chef Reef was on the show, Chef Orfali was on the show, Chris Khalifa was on the show, a lot of these people. And what I'm trying to say is, so it felt at that point very organic. This was now part of the fabric of the show and what we're trying to do. I think it didn't feel like we're attaching ourselves to a big name brand, frankly. But if anything, we are continuing to tell the story of those entrepreneurs as it evolves. That to me was very, very important in deciding to go ahead and do a show about Mina 50 Best or Michelin, because I wouldn't have just covered Michelin, but I would cover Michelin if it's
in the context of
telling and changing the story. And that's why we went to some of those entrepreneurs and we spoke to them as part of this episode. We called them up and we said, how do you feel after getting this award? How has it changed your business? And that conversation is ongoing. And also because in many ways, it was a watershed moment for the F&B industry in the region. I mean, it's getting that recognition now, good and the bad, and we've debated this. I happen to share the same view as Samantha, who was also on the show for Diva, who said that she feels it's still very lopsided towards international brands, big brands, and not towards homegrown concepts. I agree. I'm not just saying this because we have a homegrown concept. I think that will be part of the evolution of MENA 50 Best of Michelin. If I would look 5, 10, 15 years from now, it will all be homegrown, in my view. Maybe you'll have one or two, big names that have built a brand for themselves, because even a Zuma Dubai is a very unique within the Zuma collection. So that may deserve to be there, but I don't think you're going to have many Zumas on the shelf. You're going to have a lot more of the Orfalis on the list and the Lighthouses and so on and so forth, hopefully, than others. So that felt organic, and I think I feel good about that, or else I would have not done it. And a year ago, I would have not done it. I don't think I would have said yes.
It's also natural for us we kind of, I think, now know very clearly what the show is about and what it's about to do. And hence, moving away from that, let's say, just for an odd episode or doing a special like that one, doesn't seem out of the way.
And some episodes, like Assam was a very important episode for me as well, because we have been talking about Dubai a lot, obviously, over the last couple of years. And I feel he had summarized part of the Dubai story for us coming from a government's perspective. And that was very important, because we were here during the pandemic. We all lived it. A lot of the entrepreneurs that we have on the show live in Dubai or have been in Dubai during the pandemic. And I feel that Assam show really encapsulated what Dubai did within a larger context of Michelin, tourist strategy, growth, etc. And that was fascinating. And I'm not saying that, I want to just be rah-rah, but they really deserve credit for having built the infrastructure for all of us to frankly thrive. And you can't say this about too many places. And I feel very strongly about that when it comes to Dubai and the UAE and what we've seen over the last couple of years. It's been good for our mental health, and it helped us do those types of things and not just be preoccupied with the pandemic and the many challenges that came with it.
Yeah, and you look at the parallels again, and I know Issam mentioned it as well, is how the Dubai government almost functions like a startup.
100%.
Right?
And you
so
felt it in their office.
And that parallel of what we're building and how we see the startup world and actual business versus a government stepping up and saying, we won't get everything right, but we're going to try all of these things and explore.
And I feel we're documenting this, right? Which is fun.
Exactly.
We're documenting this. My Egyptian side came out for a minute. We're documenting this. No, we're documenting this as it's happening in real time.
And I think the good thing, as you mentioned, with
Traveling gourmand. Yeah. I just remember that I was called Traveling Gourmand, so I feel like I need to say this a few times. Traveling Gourmand.
Yeah, that should have been the theme of
I mean, I feel like that was very important. The MENA 50 thing. Since then, Traveling Gourmand. It's great.
It's a little ASMR for our listeners.
What does ASMR mean?
No, at the moment I forgot it, but there you go. It's basically it's through the use of primarily sound.
Bravo, Farah. But can we just go back to the point that you are talking about something that you didn't even know what it meant? That is a very dangerous path, my friend.
No, I said
I don't remember very strongly.
I don't remember the abbreviation.
That in 2023 we should not use acronyms, or we don't know what it actually. I mean, Traveling Gourmand.
If you have a problem, you can talk to Elon.
Okay, seriously.
Yeah, he'll put it to a vote. We'll figure it out.
Yeah.
I've completely lost my train. Anyway,
he's completely lost.
No, I'm trying to remember where I wanted to move it to.
Shall we give you a moment?
No, I wanted to see where we want to move it to.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. We'll give Chirag a minute to gather his thoughts and be right back with our review. In the meantime, subscribe to our YouTube channel, which you can find under the Lighthouse Conversations podcast. You'll find many snippets of the many conversations we've had over the last couple of years, which I think you'll find interesting. Welcome back. You're listening to the Lighthouse Conversations with me, Hashem Muntasir, and today I'm joined by my producer, Chirag Desai. I'm honestly being very forthcoming by saying when I think about this year, upcoming year, I don't have a script, neither in terms of the guests, nor in terms of the topics. I feel, to the point you made earlier, the show feels a bit more mature. I feel a little bit more confident in a style of telling stories and interviewing and talking to people. It may rub some people the wrong way, and I'm sure it does, but that's okay. I don't think we're trying to, it has to also be true to me personally. So I feel very good about all of these things, but I'm very deliberately keeping it not very scripted.
What I would differentiate is, but we do know the kind of stories we want to tell. We do know who makes a good guest for us.
That's 100% true.
Who furthers that story for us. We do know that, and that's kind of the basis on which
That's true.
we,
And
we do that.
it doesn't take us long to recognize who. To your point, I see someone, I'm like, this will be a great guest. For different reasons sometimes. They're not all for the same reasons. And it's also, frankly, very easy to spot who would not be a good guest.
I was about to say, the elimination is true too. Yeah, it's who would not
sure.
be. I was having a conversation with someone a few weeks ago, and we were talking about the show, and one of the things they said was, how do you get it right every time? How is it that you have
That's very generous.
It even made me think for a bit. I'm like, well, we have, quote unquote, this concept, and the philosophy, I think, is what the word I would use, behind the show, and we stay true to that.
And the angles that come up a lot of times are really spontaneous. So we go in talking about, even talking to Sam, I mean, the angle was really Michelin. We spent 10, 15 minutes on that. And the bulk of the episode talking about Dubai and its overall strategy. Sometimes things happen. When we went to talk to Ahmed Al-Marri, I mean, we spent some time talking about his brand and canvas, but a lot more time talking about imposter syndrome. Sort of like, I'm exaggerating, but you know what I mean? I mean, in the sense that I think being a little bit flexible is really important. Many cases we go in and we discuss certain things. I mean, Buksha, you made that point, been covered by everybody, New York Times, Financial Times, how to spend it, etc., etc. None of what we talked about was in there. We all read those articles, or anywhere for that matter.
Yeah.
Talking to Fadi, who again is a very well-known, successful figure. Of course, we touched on Aramex, but I felt a lot of people came to me and said, we found things out that we didn't know. They didn't know certain things about how Aramex started, that it went public, went back private, went public again. That's not necessarily the narrative. A very diligent journalist might find that. But so those are the kind of nuggets that I personally find fascinating. And that really, and we covered this before, I think comes down to curiosity.
But
ultimately.
I think it's not as incidental as you're making it sound right now. I think it's deliberate, right? So in the sense that when we say this, when we say we're not, it's not about the destination, about the journey. It is sometimes, where you'll hear someone during the interview go, well, I did this and I did that. No, but how did you get there?
You're 100%
Or why
right.
did you make that decision? And that becomes the focus. And that's why we get these, I think that's why you have the interviews that are so powerful sometimes, where you get backwards into thinking about what was their mindset, or what was the thing that, I mean, I remember Stasha, 21 grams.
Yeah, that's another one.
Talking about how she decided to leave, Serbia and come down to Dubai because she was like, that's it. My growth was capped and I wanted to go. And the fact that you asked her, like, yeah, but why would you do that?
She wanted a different opportunity.
And she wanted to do it on her own. Right. And that was it. And it's come with its own challenges. And of course, there was a long conversation about mental health for entrepreneurs that came as a consequence of that conversation.
And one hack that I've learned, and I read this, a number of people do this, not Tim Ferriss, incidentally, and some of the very research people. And it works for him. He's highly researched, but also he has an army of people searching for him. Not to take away from his show. It's a fantastic show. But I'm just saying is while I do a lot of research, I shy away from overdoing it, because what happens then is you have a bunch of questions you feel you need to tick off. Yeah. And that does not make for a good show. So my personal formula, what works for me, is I go in, I have my questions, which we send in advance, guiding questions as we call them, but then I'm very comfortable moving completely away from it. And if I don't cover any of it, that's fine. It's simply there to guide the conversation, especially at the beginning, and move us in direction. That's one thing. Another hack, if you will, or learning from this last year has been with some of the guests, which doesn't happen very often, but sometimes does, that we don't know, is to take a little bit of time pre-show to get to know them. I was
just about to say that.
And even if that's just half an hour coffee at the Lighthouse in D3, sometimes they don't have the time for that. So we would have a quick call. Just that connection, I feel, makes a difference and puts them at ease. In the early days of the show, I think underappreciated that a little bit. in the sense that I was like, what's the big deal? They're going to come. And then it felt like an interview, and it felt sometimes a little forced. They didn't know me. They didn't know the show. They didn't know what to expect. And maybe my style of asking questions and talking is also a bit much for them. So all of those things I feel like been fine-tuned a tiny bit. Now, one thing I'd love to do in 23, I was thinking about that the other day, is we should, even if it's here, by the way, we should do a show with food.
People can't see this on the episode or can't hear this, but Farah's jumping up and down because this is something she's been talking about for 4 years.
And we could go back to the slurping of Barbara Streisand, but I feel we've covered that.
Yeah, we have.
We've covered that a few times, although that is great. But I do feel that food. So we've been always thinking about food, and it took me. I mean, one night I couldn't sleep very well, and I thought of that. I was like, we always thought about it at the Lighthouse, which is great, but it doesn't have to be. We could actually bring some food here, and I feel that would make it kind of lunch with the FT meets the Lighthouse Conversations.
The FT's back again.
Yeah, I mean, not just lunch with FT. Look, the FT is FT, but how to spend it and lunch with FT are special. So I feel like it makes it that, although we don't even need to borrow from them, we do our own thing.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think there's scope to build something that is a Lighthouse Conversations product as opposed to an FT one.
No, I was using the FT as a benchmark for those that read Lunch with FT.
No, I'm with you.
He's like, screw them. But anyway, yeah.
One of the things I think that's a hallmark of this show and kind of the process of it is time. So we talked about time kind of incidentally when we said sometimes someone's not ready and they come back later, and that there's time there. There's time that we spend doing some of the research that happens ahead of the guest. There's time that you spend with the person before. I mean, I think now it's become initially it was kind of, oh, I don't really know this person so well, let me grab coffee with them first, and kind of, everybody feels more relaxed when they come on the show. I think now it's become the norm, where you spend time with them. And I think that changes what happens in the interview. It's something that's been pointed out to me a couple of times. Say, like, does he just know everybody? I said, no, actually, there is time spent to do that.
I know everybody.
I know
everybody.
You know everybody. Happy birthday!
Absolutely
right. And I think that actually adds. Sometimes it's very easy to look at, and this is true, by the way, of anything. It's true for startups, it's true for content, to look at the piece that's produced and say, oh, like, how did you get to this? And the reality of it is a lot of that happens outside of that specific 100%. Moment.
Yeah. And again, I think that's where also the Lighthouse comes in. I mean, being associated and part of a restaurant group where a lot of people come in and out for various reasons helps and facilitate that. There's no question about that. So I personally meet a lot of people there. I get to know them there. Not everybody, but some. And some people sometimes I earmark for a potential candidate, and I kind of wait and see, and then I see them once, twice, and 3 times, and then so that definitely has helped. We are a little bit less. We are not as isolated, in that sense, and much more connected to the day-to-day of Dubai. And that's what makes it fun, frankly, is to document this entire process.
No, it goes back to time, right? Like you said, sometimes you mark something and you come back to it later.
Yeah.
I was having a conversation with someone quite some time ago where they said, oh, this show, and not necessarily specific to this show, but other shows as well, is interesting, but you go every other week. Why not weekly? I had to think about it, but then I was like, you know why? Because that would start killing the purpose of the show.
100%.
Where now you're on that kind of a tight deadline
and we would start backfilling because we need to have a show next week.
I also think from a listener's point of view, the fact that there is a bit of a wait, and I know Netflix has really killed this entire thing. I have nothing against Netflix. I like everything that they're doing. I love the fact you can binge something. But there is something that was lost in that, right? The anticipation of something coming out. The fact that everybody's discussing it around the same time. It became a community event to watch a show. And I think, again, like I said, I think that's, Netflix has succeeded in its own right. And I think what they're doing is fantastic in terms of what they've done for content worldwide. But there's changing
consumer behavior.
Absolutely. But there is something to an anticipation. There is something to create long-term value around something that we're building. And, we're not Netflix. We're building our own pieces of content that we think is interesting. and overdoing it is just as harmful as underdoing it. And we have to find a sweet spot.
I agree. I mean, there's one thing, and I don't want to get too much into that because it's not part of this episode necessarily. But, this morning coming in here, I was listening to an Acquired episode, which has this very long form, 2+ hours. And they had it with Ben Thompson, who does Stratechery.
I just heard it, yeah.
And it was so interesting. One of the things that Ben said he's working on, and he's in many ways a pioneer of email, I guess blogging, you can call it. And he's really pioneered his brand. So for those that we'll put in the show notes, but don't know him, Ben Thompson writes this very, very influential blog called the Stratechery. It's such a bad name.
Which he admits on the show.
He talked about it. It's like strategy and tech. Which is brilliant, and came up with all of these ideas, aggregation theory, etc. And now he's has been venturing into podcasting. And one of the things he said, because he built his own platform for his blog.
It's called Passport. Yeah.
It's called Passport, exactly. Is that it comes to podcasts, the medium of sharing is still super underdeveloped. And that's very true. It's very easy to share a blog post or an email newsletter.
And a YouTube link, for example.
And a YouTube link. It is still very clunky to share anything to do with podcasts, which means that on social media, it has, in my view, has under-traveled, quote unquote. And I'd like to see that changing. It's nice to see now that you can post from Spotify on Instagram stories, etc. I'm hoping that as we grow, those the technology around it grows. And a guy like Ben Thompson is able to, okay, that's not the Egyptian thing, by the way. They use the b, sometimes say p. So today's been, pen, this has been it's my Egypt day.
Yeah.
Ben Thompson, so he is able to go and say, let me do something about it, which is great, frankly. But I'd like to see that change a bit, because I feel that would really revolutionize the way podcasts are consumed. And I feel they're still a much, much smaller part of, the streaming world versus other things like movies and Netflix and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and I think, there's a lot of players have to play their parts to make all of that happen. Of course, what Ben Thompson's doing is building entirely a custom solution to doing that, and that's not.
Is it good? I haven't checked out Passport. I mean, I read his newsletter, which is perfectly
No, I do.
fine.
I mean, so I subscribe to a couple of shows from within the Passport sort of ecosystem now.
Yeah.
And I think it's fantastic what he's able to do, because he can do a lot of custom things, right? So in my RSS feed, when I open an episode, it's got my name and my subscription status and everything in the episodes, because he's custom built it. And I think that's great. But obviously for scale and for us to see that, the other players have to get on board and kind of do their parts. But I think from our side, we can also do some things. So we've been talking about kind of looking at things like YouTube and other platforms, and how we can integrate what I would call the top of that funnel, right? To say, here are different ways in which,
100%.
or the touch points in which someone can come get introduced to the show, and how we bring them back to the full episode eventually, right?
Yeah, and we're rebranding now. So I think part of that rebrand is doing that. So we're becoming much more conscious about, when you search, how do you search? So my name will go up as part of the episode so that people can search this way. We are, changing visually the icon, how that would look and sit in the various players. And we even discussed openly, right, potentially having kind of the Lighthouse podcast as a brand, and underneath it to have multiple podcasts. It doesn't even need to be me.
You're just giving away all of the the sneak peeks now.
I mean, it may be something we do, it may be something we don't do. To be very frank, I mean, I'm also bringing it up because it'd be interesting to hear what people think of that. Should we consider potentially having more than one podcast? I mean, a guy like Invest Like the Best, again, I mean, he was very successful in his podcast and eventually started this Colossus network, which now hosts him doing various podcasts, but also others. So all of these things, but again, my view is it's organic. Give it its time. Certainly, popping up is important. The rebrand was partially what we did 3-4 years ago. Feels now a little dated, and feels like we've grown as a brand, as you said. We're in many more social media channels. I mean, we're now on TikTok, on YouTube, over and above the players, and we'll keep experimenting, because that world is changing as well.
Yeah, and I think, when you look at how you have built the Lighthouse and how important all of those touch points are for you, just from a restaurant point of view, not even looking at the podcast for a minute, all of that speaks to that larger brand identity. Yes. All of that speaks to the timelessness of and the experience of it. And today, as the show is kind of building its own identity, and now it's evolving. I think the identity is pretty set. It becomes an important part to say, okay, what is that going to look like, both not just audibly but visually, right? And how do we go and create? We're having a conversation just offline about YouTube, for example. How do we engage with an audience there, and so on?
And by the way, that was always the thinking behind the Lighthouse in general. So you have the Lighthouse as a platform, and today we have, and we just revamped our concept presentation because we've grown in so many different directions. But the idea was always there that under the Lighthouse, you would have restaurants, you would have catering, you would have a retail or concept store, and you would have podcasts. But each one of those channels evolved in its own way. Some of them are now, like the podcast, are worthy of almost spinning out because they have their own audience, their own brand. But to me, they never felt like there's a conflict here. The only challenge, and remains a bit of a challenge, is how do you bring it all under one umbrella without confusing the end audience consumers? Because people come to us for different reasons. Some come to shop, some come to eat, some come to listen. But I feel like very gratified, frankly, that every time one of those sort of starts getting its own identity, I feel it's graduated from like freshman year to, to being a sophomore to a junior, then eventually kind of like full graduation.
I don't think there's a better way to end this episode.
Yeah. But the only thing is after they graduate, they have to get a job. I don't know if that's a bad...
You had to mention that,
I have to end on a kind of a downer. I mean, I can't be overly optimistic. I mean, is that bad? I'm also wearing black and... I always wear black, but I used to wear white sometimes.
I feel like I should just leave this sort of existential debate like just floating out in ether. But no, well, thank you, Hashem. I think it's fantastic. I enjoy doing this because I know some of these conversations we have from time to time as the year goes on, but it's nice to be able to also document these and talk about our evolution, both as a show and also as its own identity. So that's been super fun. And we're excited to
23, here we come. Thank you, Chirag. Thank you, Farah.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us throughout 2022. Your support means a lot to us. Please send us your comments, either in person or online. You can find the show in your favorite podcast app, whether it's Apple, Spotify, and Remy, you name it. You can also find many of our clips on YouTube by searching for the Lighthouse Conversations podcast or going on Instagram to the Lighthouse_AE. We'll be back again in 2 weeks with a brand new guest. See you then.